Hello and welcome to World Talks here on TVP World with me, Ashim Kumar. Tuesday marked the 4th anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, a conflict many expected to last only weeks, but which has stalled at immense cost to Moscow. To examine what has happened in this time and what lies ahead, we're joined by Keir Giles, a Russia expert at Chatham House. Keir, thank you very much for taking the time to join us. Welcome.
Good evening.
Good evening. Right, so it's been 4 years yesterday. How would you characterise the state of the war as it stands at the moment?
Well, continuing, and 2025 was full of repeated surges of optimism that an end to the war might actually be near, mostly based on the promises of the United States and the pretense that there was some kind of peace process. But anybody that has looked at the fundamental causes of the war, Russia's determination to destroy Ukraine, knew that actually this was a false premise and there was no reason to think that peace was actually closer. So we're still in a situation where neither coalition, neither the one backing Ukraine nor the one backing Russia, has decided to intervene decisively to bring the war to an end, and so it continues.
Intervene in what way?
We could have seen a much earlier intervention by Western powers supporting Ukraine, to give Ukraine the support that was unconditional, not constrained, not holding back on what Ukraine was allowed to do with the weapon systems that were supplied by its Western backers when it was in a position of advantage with relation to Russia. We could also see, for example, Russia's backers deciding that they want the war to come to an end, possibly on their terms. The leverage that China has over Russia at the moment is something which they could, if they wished to, use to bring about a different outcome. But of course, it's in China's interests to see their major global competitors weakening each other, and Russia, of course, slowly destroying itself, so eventually it will fall into China's hands.
Right, so basically China is using Ukraine to weaken Russia.
Well, Russia is using Ukraine to weaken Russia as well as not succeeding in achieving its objectives.
Right.
But
Sorry, go on.
The long-term trajectory, of course, is China growing stronger, Russia growing weaker, which we'd seen before, but it's accelerated that process. The way in which Russia is tearing itself apart, trying to win this war, means that eventually it won't be in a position to resist any of China's demands.
So you're saying Russia is growing weaker, but you know, when you listen to the rhetoric, the propaganda almost that's coming out of Moscow, one wouldn't believe it. I mean, you know, they've lost, by some estimates, 1.2 million people, with those projected to go up to 2 million this year. And yet they keep on coming. How do you explain that?
Well, this is one of the reasons why you shouldn't listen to the propaganda. Unfortunately, Russia has done an exceptionally good job of convincing some people around the world, including apparently people in the White House in the United States, that their victory is inevitable. It is only a matter of time before Russia achieves its objectives, before the front line crumbles, before they overrun the country once again in exactly the same way they expect to do in 2022. Again, it's clear that that is not what is happening, and yet that is the narrative that they have successfully sold to people, which is why you have this idea of a potential unconditional ceasefire suddenly becoming far from the worst case outcome that it was before the arrival of Donald Trump in January 2025 to becoming one of the least worst, because the logic goes, if Russia will inevitably win, then why not cut short the process and save lives?
Right, well, that, as you say, that is certainly the way of thinking in some places in the West. But 40% of the Russian economy is geared towards the war, executing the war. Russia is being supported by, for example, Iran in terms of weaponry. It's getting its oil out in the shadow fleet. It sounds as though it's sitting comfortably.
It's not comfortable if you're looking at the long-term future of Russia, because Russia has mortgaged its economy, its demography, its population to this war. But the current leadership in the Kremlin thinks that that is less important than achieving this messianic goal of restoring the empire. For the time being, Russia is not being given sufficient pressure to make sure that that economic calculus changes against the decision to continue the war. For example, by cutting off those oil revenues you referred to. The fact that the shadow fleet still operates, still brings in the money, still tops up Russia's reserves for waging its war means that that point of potential economic collapse, potential repercussions in terms of how they prosecute the war, gets further and further away.
What could Putin do? Let's suppose he comes to that tipping point where, the country simply is exhausted in terms of resources. Could he step back and say, well, no, that was a bit of a mistake. Let's call an end to this. Poland's foreign minister called Putin's invasion a criminal mistake. Can Putin actually back off and say, sorry, guys, this was a bit of a miscalculation?
Well, it certainly was criminal. Whether it was a mistake or not, of course, depends on whether you were sitting in the Kremlin at the time. Because if you believed the Kremlin's own propaganda, as they plainly did, then this was a perfectly rational choice, expecting Ukraine to simply fall over and fall into the Kremlin's hands intact. Now, we knew at the time that this was not going to happen because we had paid attention to Ukraine as well as to Russia. But again, sadly, this was a story that was successfully told to the outside world. What Putin could do now, if he does decide that that tipping point has been reached and it's time to take a pause, is simply take what is on offer from the United States, trying to pressure Ukraine into a form of surrender, to impose this ceasefire, to freeze the conflict, to allow Russia that time to regenerate its forces faster without Ukraine destroying them almost as quickly as they can be rebuilt, and get itself ready for the next push, wherever that may be, in Ukraine or elsewhere.
Right, now, President Donald Trump, in his State of the Union address yesterday, spoke about the numbers of people dying, and he's made a big deal of stopping wars around the world. Why isn't he doing more than he already is to put pressure on Russia?
Well, when he talks, as he said, about 25,000 people dying per day, and he repeated that figure several times, it gave the impression, as it's done so often before, that he's talking about Russian casualties as a cause for concern. His idea of how to bring this conflict to an end is all about Ukraine meeting Russia's demands, as opposed to actually trying to influence the one person who can bring this war to an end. It's not Donald Trump, it's Vladimir Putin. But throughout this whole process, we've seen all of the pressure being put on Ukraine because that is easier. And we still see Donald Trump and many of the people around him still enthralled to this idea that Russia has to be appeased, that Russia has the control over their imaginations to the extent that they cannot challenge Moscow.
Could Trump be actually playing a game to kind of alienate China by befriending Russia?
That argues a level of sophistication from the decision-making process within the White House that is not evident in many of its other dealings.
In other words, you're skeptical.
I am.
All right. Now, Valery Zaluzhny spoke at Chatham House yesterday, I believe, and he's Ukraine's ambassador to the UK. What were his main views?
Well, sitting in the room for Zaluzhny's speech, which I was, it was a sense of familiarity because this was not the first time he had given a speech like this as ambassador to London, standing in front of a Chatham House audience. And it was the same warning, in a way, that he had already delivered. He was talking about what a lot of people call the war of the future, but pointing out that this is the war of today in Ukraine, and other countries are simply not ready for it. He was talking about the technological transformation of warfighting, what that means for outdated concepts of front lines, of armored formations and so on, and how it argues for a transformation not only of defense, but also of the entire industrial complex supporting defense. He was asking people to understand that the future is here now, and they're being left behind by it.
And he referred to robotization and so on. And we see, of course, Ukraine making excellent use of drones and various other non-human, if I can put it like that, elements in the battlefield. Is Europe doing enough to keep up on that score?
It doesn't appear so. He was talking about robotization, AI, drones, the way all of these things come together into a new form of warfare. And we've seen examples, for instance, here in Poland, where the investments that are being made in making defense ready for the 21st century aren't always in the right area. Poland has been the leader among European nations in getting itself ready for the challenge that is coming. And yet, when it's faced with drone incursions on a tiny fraction of the scale that Ukraine faces every night, it turned out that the defensive systems that were in place were not quite ready for that. And if that's the case for Poland, think how much more so it is for those countries west of Warsaw that have still not gripped the challenge even of starting that major rearmament process, let alone thinking about which direction it's supposed to take.
So basically, if I understand you correctly, Western Europe simply doesn't have a clue at the moment what it needs to actually achieve if it's going to be effective in any kind of defence.
Well, I have a particularly jaundiced view of this coming from the UK, where there's been a great deal of talk but next to no action. And finding ways to meet this notional commitment of 5% on defence, 3.5% on defence and 1.5% on resilient, without actually having to spend any more money at all. All of that is deeply depressing when you look at the scale of the challenge that not just the frontline states but the whole of Europe is facing.
And we've seen, with Russia that it's not carrying out only kinetic war. It's using all sorts of means, methodologies to attack Western Europe. So many people say that Russia's already at war with the EU. Would you agree with that view?
Absolutely. It's at war in every way except rolling tanks across the border. And this is not a new phenomenon. People think of the campaigns of arson and sabotage and murder across Europe as being something that's happened after the beginning of the full-scale war on Ukraine. But as long ago as 2021, I wrote a book called Russia's War on Everybody, talking about all of this happening in the previous decade. It is a default state for Russia to be conducting hostile actions against those countries it considers its adversaries, even if those adversaries think they're in a state of peace.
A default state for Russia. Keir Giles, unfortunately we're going to have to end it there, but thank you very much indeed for sharing your analysis with our audience.
Thank you.
Brings us to the end of this episode of World Talks. Don't go away, lots more coming up. Goodbye.